Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to call the Committee of the Whole to order. I'm sitting in for Brian today to figure out how this hybrid meeting format works. So I'll be chairing today. We are continuing to meet on Zoom. We are testing some hybrid meeting capabilities. So a handful of us are in the council chambers working out the bugs. But members of the public are still welcome to join our meeting via Zoom. That link to join can be found at ci.missoula.mt.us/webcasts. There you'll find the link to join the live meeting. There's also instructions there to join by phone. If you're in the meeting as a member of the public and you want to provide public comment, please use the hand raise feature within Zoom to raise or lower your hand. And if you're joining in by phone, you can press *9 on your phone to raise your hand. You can also provide public comment to us by voicemail at 406-552-6012 or by email at council@ci.missoula.mt.us. With that, our first item of business is roll call.
Would you like me to call roll, Jordan?
That'd be great, Megan. Thank you.
Okay. Anderson?
Present.
Becerra? Contos?
He's going to be absent today.
Thank you. Harp? Hess?
Present.
Jones?
She's absent for the afternoon.
Merritt?
Present.
Ramos? Cheryl?
Present.
Basika?
Present.
Von Lossberg?
Here.
West?
Here.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have minutes from July 28th. Are there any changes to those minutes? Seeing none, those will be approved. Is there any public comment on items not listed elsewhere on our agenda? Seeing none, we have one regular agenda item. This is an informational presentation on Missoula's rental market and rental assistance programs that are available right now. We have folks from our CPDI department to present on that topic, and Mayor Engen is here. And Mayor, I believe you'd like to say some introductory remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for the opportunity. Clearly, we are hearing from residents that that eviction and challenges around making rent are paramount, and certainly a concern for both folks who are potentially facing eviction and for property owners and landlords as well. And I have done a little bit of squawking about this, and to the credit of our friends at the Montana Department of Commerce who are administering rental assistance, they not only heard me squawk, but reached out to provide some actual accurate information, and I'm grateful for that. Always happy to have good information available to the folks we all serve together. I hope that this is an opportunity for council members as well as members of the public to get some answers and some additional information. We do know that resources are available. We do know that those resources are available in Missoula, and that the state of Montana has been working diligently with some local partners to get that money out of the door to ensure that folks aren't suffering needlessly as this pandemic rolls along. So once again, I'm grateful to our friends at the state, and look forward to hearing more today.
Thank you, Mayor. And we have Montana James here from CPDI. Montana, do you want to take it away and introduce our guest today?
I will, yeah, thank you. I have a few quick introductory slides that I'll share. All right, as long as that's coming through okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Montana James, Deputy Director of Community Development within Community Planning, Development, and Innovation. And also here today is Ricky Henderson, our Housing Programs Manager in the department. And we are excited to bring you this panel of really thoughtful and smart people before you to share more information about the rental housing market in Missoula, and to share information about the resources available at the state level to support Missoula residents facing housing challenges. Well, as of yesterday, Missoula County is again subject to an eviction moratorium through the CDC. We know that those moratoriums are limited, and we've seen how that has played out at the federal level. We've had good protection so far, but there are various challenges to those moratoriums. So this is something that's been on our mind, and something that we continue to track and watch for, and make sure that we're connecting with the resources available. So briefly, before I turn things over to our presenters, I wanted to just frame the conversation a little bit more. As the mayor mentioned, over the past several months, we've heard from many of you and many residents in Missoula concern about the intensity of our rental market, and the general lack of vacancies as well as displacement. So we have been closely following these policies at the federal level for the last year and a half, and working to track any data that's available about the numbers, excuse me, of Missoula residents who are potentially affected by or facing displacement because of non-payment of rent due to COVID and the pandemic, and for other reasons. So a recent analysis that we have been looking at was performed based on the household pulse survey that the census did. And that suggested that 9.1% of Missoula County renters identified themselves as behind on rent. And that of that group, the average back rent, or the average of what they owed, was about $2,600. So as you'll hear more today, the vacancy rate in our rental market has been dangerously low for several months now. So we wanted to bring this group together to we hope to answer some key questions that we've been hearing. And some of those questions include things like, what does the current available data tell us about the Missoula rental market? What are our local property managers and landlords seeing in their units and with their tenants? And again, what resources are available through federal funding to support renters who are struggling in Missoula? And again, we're so thankful for this group, for our panel of presenters who are joining us. They span a breadth of experience and expertise in the Missoula rental market and are able to share some important perspectives with you about what we're seeing and what resources there are. So first, Matt with Sterling CRE will share some current data with us about the rental vacancy rate in Missoula and the construction trends in that area. We're hoping this will help shape the conversation around what we're seeing in the rental market in Missoula and provide some data in which to ground the conversations about what our property managers and landlords are experiencing right now. Matt is a principal and supervising broker at Sterling CRE Advisors, a commercial real estate advising and property management company. After that, Andrea Davis will share with us some, oh, sorry, Matt. I was just going to go through the full group and then I'll turn it over to you. I should have explained that. You can leave your slides up though as well. So after Matt, Andrea will share with us some more about what the rental market feels like on the ground for a nonprofit housing developer and property manager. Andrea is the executive director at Homeward, a statewide nonprofit housing developer and property manager, as well as housing counseling agency that offers important financial, renter, and home buyer education in the community. Erin Gengarelli will also share with us the perspective and experiences of a market rate property management company in today's market. Erin is president of Summit Property Management here in Missoula, a well-known property management company with both residential and commercial properties. And then lastly, Cheryl Cohen with Montana Housing will provide some information on the programs available through the state of Montana to support renters through emergency rental assistance program and other funding programs at Montana Department of Commerce. And Cheryl is the division administrator at Montana Housing and has extensive experience working with HUD programs and property and asset management. So I hope to leave a good time for questions from you all. And with that, Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Montana, and thank you to the community development team for including our research in this conversation. So the information that we will present today comes from a sizable data library that we've accumulated over the last 4.5 to 5 years. It has real estate transactions, market data on vacancy and absorption, development trends, and some other data that we pull in from the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we have a full-time researcher on staff that helps us keep track of this. Which has been very helpful. So our intention with all of this is not collecting data for the sake of data, but to support healthy and sustainable development in Missoula. And so we'll share this multifamily data that we've collected coming from that perspective. So one of the things that a number of things that we track, one of them is vacancy rates in the multifamily market. We'll use the term multifamily and apartments interchangeably. There's some distinction that may be made between multifamily and apartment, but we'll use them interchangeably, and we're referring to the same thing. So when it comes to vacancy, you can look here and see since Q1 of 2019, so the last 2.5 years, basically, the vacancy rates for apartments in Missoula County, and you can see how it's trended down over time. The most recent snapshot was taken in middle of May of this year. And you can see that, as Montana mentioned earlier, we're at 0.38% for apartment vacancy in Missoula, which is effectively a non-functioning market. I mean, that's you can barely do turnover at a vacancy rate that's that low. So this is, you can look at numbers and they don't mean anything, but what this is, it's basically putting a number to what we already know, which is apartments are really hard to find in Missoula if you're a renter. So important note on this is this only captures multifamily complexes that have 5 or more units. Though anecdotally, we have heard, we don't track these in the same level, smaller complexes, so your 4plexes and under and some of those things, and for rent single family homes are experiencing similar levels of non-availability or basically very low vacancy. If we had a healthier market, generally between 4 and 5% is considered a healthy market. So you can see that we were there in kind of early 2019 and have trended down to where it is effectively an unhealthy market, especially from the renter standpoint. And then I guess the big point to note is the big disruption over the last 2.5 years or year and a half, really, I guess, most specifically is as it relates to since the pandemic in Q2 of 2020, and kind of in the middle of the screen there, you see that it spiked briefly when there's all the uncertainty coming about in April timeframe. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. Vacancy actually spiked, just not spiked, but went up to about 4.2%, and then just precipitously down since then. And if you average it out over the last year, the vacancy rates are about 1%. So, so again, numbers don't mean anything without some context. So what is, when you have a dramatic decrease like this, what does it actually mean for Missoulians? So this slide here is, showing the relationship between supply and demand and its impact on rental rates. So the way to look at this is on the bottom, you've got the bars that show actual unit counts of unit types available. In Q2 of 2020 is the dark blue, and then the light blue is Q2 of 2021. So again, taken about mid-May of this last year. And you can see that there were maybe not tons of units available, but there were units available a year ago, a little over a year ago. And now there are virtually almost nothing. I mean, just over 20 units total across the survey of over 6,000 units. You can see that it is very difficult if you're a renter competing for these very few available properties. And then the corresponding, what that's done to prices, you can see where the green line is the average rent by unit type in Q2 of 2020, and then the yellow line shows you what it was a year later. So different unit types have had different impacts. They've all gone up. If you averaged all of them together, it's about a 16% increase. Certain unit types like 2-bed, 2-bath have gone up by about 25% in 1 year. So that's yeah, I mean, for your average renter, if your income is not going up in a corresponding fashion, then the squeeze on renters is pretty pronounced, as you can see by this slide. I guess for comparison's sake, wages have been going up according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and American Community Survey from the Census Bureau. In 2020, the ACS said it was about 5.5% wage growth on average in Missoula, but when your rents are going up anywhere from 7% on the low end, depending upon unit type, all the way up to 25% on the high end if you're after a 2-bed, 2-bath, those are not keeping pace with one another. So what happens is when these things are out of whack, it starts to push people out of Missoula, out of the core of the town, and then even out in the periphery into other counties. So the result of that is if you're a local business and you are looking for staff, your difficulty is compounded because there are fewer people that are able to be in close proximity to where their job is at. One other thing that we do, this is about the rental market. One of the things that we've realized over the last couple of years is that even if you track the rental market, you really need to look at the bigger picture of what is the rental market and the for sale market are interchangeable. And a lot of the impacts on vacancy and absorption, rental rates and for sale prices are all pretty tightly tied together. And so you can't necessarily look at just the rental market in isolation. You need to look at it in context of overall new production of units, so basically permitted units. And I'll cover that a little bit more in the next slide here. But one of the things that we also do is we have something called the Home Survey. It was about just over 300 people that were surveyed, and then a focus group of 20 people asking questions about who is looking to buy a house, what are their obstacles to purchasing a house, what types of houses would they look at, all these different things. And so you can see on the screen some of the responses that we've received from people in Missoula. These are people that would like to buy houses and can't, and then also talks about some of the preferences and things that they would look at. So, what you can see is that people are open to smaller footprints. They're open to something other than a traditional single family home. Things like co-housing, tenants as partners, tiny homes are all things that Missoulians have said that they would consider. And most of the people in this survey are ready to buy a home or want to buy a home. But when you look at the reasons why they can't, it can be pretty depressing, I guess, depending upon what your perspective is on it. So often it comes down to the fact that they cannot find anything within their price range. And a lot of that will come to a supply and demand question, which again, we'll cover in the next slide. If you look on the right here, we're doing all the right things, but we could be forced out of the community we love. I'm very concerned that renters and lower income residents are going to have to leave Missoula because of housing costs and lack of inventory, current wages versus increasing cost of living. So all these responses that we get from the focus groups and from the survey mirror what the data is saying, kind of independent of those surveys and focus groups. I think a big takeaway from all this is that the housing crunch doesn't just impact people in apartments or houses. It's basically it's across the board. So you can't just isolate it to like, oh, this is a renter problem, or this is a single family, somebody trying to buy a single family home problem. The problems are all tied together for various groups of people. And then you see that even from what the Montana Housing Coalition is saying, Senator Tester, Bozeman City's manager saying the same thing, Christina Henderson with the High Tech Business Alliance, all of them are, pointing to a lack of housing options and affordable housing options as it's a disincentive, or it is a negatively impacting our economic development opportunities. So I guess the last thing to take from this is that people are very open to different kinds of housing. And, I know density isn't always well received in some neighborhoods, but there are many Missoula families that would be well served with higher density starter housing as they get their basically financial house in order and start to get into, the homeownership world. Last thing that I'll cover here is where do we sit? What's the solution coming out of here? Like, can anything be done about it? And to quickly, I guess, discuss that this is effectively a supply and demand chart for Missoula County housing over the last, since 2010. So what you have on the bottom is the bar charts are the number of units that have been permitted by type. So single family in blue, and then multifamily in the orange, gray, and yellow. And then on the blue line, the light blue line on the top is effectively your demand curve. And what that is you take population growth year over year, you divide it by the average household size, and that will give you, the units demanded in a given year. And so when you've got a gap between the units permitted and the units demanded, then generally you're going to see that vacancy rates go down and sale prices and rental rates go up. And then if the bars go above the line, then you have the reverse of that. So this, let's real quick. So this chart, I guess one thing to note is that it would give the appearance that in 2020 that we were actually producing more units than we needed. And so you would think that rates would level off and that sort of thing. There's a little bit of a, anomaly to this, because the way that the information is collected between 2010 and 2020 is through statistical surveys performed by the American Community Survey. So it'll take a small sample of people in Missoula or any community, and then they'll extrapolate what population growth rates are and some of those things. So what happens when you get to an actual census year in 2020, it will correct that information backwards. So I think what happens here is there's assumptions made in the intervening years between 2010 and 2020, and the American Community Survey was slightly overestimating our growth. And then when it corrects in 2020, it shows that the growth rate fell off a cliff. I think what's probably, you're not going to see this from the Census Bureau, but all we've done here is we take the average growth rate over the last 5 years and just average it out at 1.8% growth year over year from 2017 on, which is approximately what we've had is around 1.8% growth. And then that will give you a clear indication of how does your supply, the units permitted to the demand line up. And you can see that when these red arrows are larger, that means there's a bigger gap between units that are being demanded and then units that we're actually producing. And so the outcome then is you got a big gap, which means prices go up, rental rates go up, options for tenants are lower or there's fewer, and then options for homeowners are fewer as well. So I guess the one takeaway that we can get from this is a very similar slide in terms of the supply on the bottom, in terms of units that are being permitted. Just in this particular slide, if you look at the light blue line, that is the median home sale price over the same time period. And one thing that we can identify here is that in 2016 and 2017, we actually produced more units than were demanded. And what happened is the growth in home price actually leveled off. It didn't go to zero, but you can see it where the red circle is at, that it flattened out compared to the next 3 years, where there's a huge gap between the number of units permitted and the number of units that are actually demanded. When there's that big gap, your prices go through the roof. And in 2016 and 2017, we were able to severely dampen out the growth in housing prices. So to me, that gives us some hope that if we actually produce the supply that we need, or slightly over even, to make up for some lost time, then something can be done about the runaway home price growth. And also, that same principle should apply on the rental side as well. But it is contingent on us producing and permitting and building enough units to meet, and then even a little bit beyond, what is demanded year over year. You don't want to overbuild for a long period of time. That's where a bubble is created. But you can see that it is possible to have an impact on the growth rate of housing costs and rental rates. So not trying to all be about problems and that sort of thing. So try to point to solutions as well. I think one thing with developers is that if we can encourage different concepts, so referring back to the home survey we're talking about, where people are open to smaller housing footprints, alternative housing types, tenants, partners, all these different options, that if we can get the regulatory side of it lined up with what the end user is actually demanding, then we can increase the number of units that we are permitting and building to help with some of the questions here on or some of the problems that we're having with runaway housing cost. And I know that Erin and her team, the development services, have been working really hard to streamline the development process. And as somebody that works with development, the development world all the time, I can say that if the more that regulatory burdens, regulatory barriers, and permitting uncertainty is removed, when that is, the more consistent it is for a developer, the more that they can predict timelines and regulatory processes, it expedites the delivery of new units and increases the overall supply of new units that we'll be able to deliver. So I'd say at the end of the day, housing is a problem directly to residents in Missoula, to tenants, to anybody looking for a house if they want to move from renting into home ownership. And the other thing that goes along with that is it's also becoming and will become more of an economic development problem, as we, if a company is coming here and they need to house their employees, their employees have fewer options, which means it is less likely to land in new companies or to keep companies around because they cannot find a spot for their employees to live. So that's all I have for this afternoon. Happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Great. Thanks, Matt. We do have a few people queued up with questions. And maybe before we do questions, Montana, what's your preference as far as, do you want to briefly take questions after each speaker and then have a more robust discussion at the end?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think each speaker will be sort of different enough on topic that we should take some time in between for questions as we have
Great.
them.
So I have Heidi first and then Heather.
Thanks. I just had a question about what's exactly meant by building permits. Are these just building permits for like new construction, especially in the single family home, like remodels don't fall into this?
Correct. Newly permitted units. This is reported by the county to the Census Bureau. So that's where this information comes from.
Thank you.
And Heather.
Thanks, Jordan. Matt, I was wondering on two different things. First off, that slide the first slide that talked about vacancy rates and how you mentioned that this is data that you obtain just from multifamily that are in excess of 5 units or more. What would it take to gather the data so that we can capture the smaller mom and pop landlord kind of environment?
We made the distinction between 5 units and higher because of how they are financed and the kind of the world that we operate in from a brokerage capacity. It'd be possible to do any of this to get down to a more granular level. It just takes a lot of grunt work basically to establish what the baseline is for those types of units. So whether it's duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, that sort of thing. So it's doable. It just takes a lot of effort to establish that. And then you monitor that same baseline or that same collection of units over time. So nothing other than just a whole lot of hours to figure it out, and then paying attention to all the different ways in which those properties are marketed for lease.
Appreciate that. And then the 2 slides later with the home survey, are those tied to the same survey that the city did recently, or was that something that CRE commissioned, if you will?
So independent of, I think they were done at similar timeframes to what the city was doing, but it was independent of that, geared more towards, what should builders be building? What units being demanded, and what are the obstacles to people actually purchasing homes? So that was the how we commissioned that survey, and that was the intent of it. And that I'm not sure if that lines up exactly with what the city had commissioned or not, but I do know they were doing one simultaneously.
Great, thank you very much.
Brian?
Thanks. Question for Montana. Pardon me. Montana, I'm wondering if we have any data around that 9.1% population of, I think, renters with the substantial back rent obligation. Do we have any sense of what that number would look like over time?
I don't have that number over time. That was an additional analysis that another firm did on the household pulse survey. So it's self-reported. The census calls folks and asks them a set of questions. And then a separate firm did an analysis to bring it down to a county by county level. So that's the first time I've seen that. The census has also shifted the frequency and the approach to those household pulse surveys. So I think that's relatively new. So I just have seen that for the most recent data as of July.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. And I'm wondering if there's any data, Matt, on for the new permits, if we know how many units are being displaced, if that trend is ticking upward or anything, like if are there units being demolished to build these new units, or are they mostly greenfield and infill, or do we have data on that?
We don't have data on that. So are you talking about if, like it's for instance, order housing or mobile homes or something like that are being displaced, and then, I don't know where we could find that information. We don't track it. And I don't think the Census Bureau does as well. One thing that I didn't mention is, the development pipeline for apartments. We kind of track things from rumor stage all the way into planning, into permitting, and then under construction until it's delivered. And there's not a whole lot of, there are projects in the pipeline. My anticipation is that you won't see a significant change to the vacancy rate for apartments this year, and probably not the first part of next year, but a bunch of units will start hitting if everything forward in the latter part of next year. So that should, corresponding increase in supply should give more options for renters, which then should hopefully increase vacancy rates a little bit and kind of maybe dampen some of the rent growth.
Thanks. Are there any additional questions for Matt? Okay, I think we can move on. Andrea, are you up next?
Yeah, Andrea, we'll kick it to you.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and also attempt to share screen and make sure that I also have my presentation in front of me here. So just give you one quick second here to make sure I'm all on board. Montana, does that look okay?
Yeah, looks great.
All right, excellent. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to have this conversation together. It's really important. I really appreciated Matt's presentation, super educational. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate what CRE is doing to track the market. I think everybody on this council and members of the public probably know who Homeward is, but just in case you don't, we're a nonprofit established in 1994 here in Missoula, but we do work statewide. We are considered a community housing development organization, both for the city of Missoula, city of Billings, and the state of Montana. We do two things. We create and rehabilitate homes that Montanans can afford, and we do that statewide. And then here in Missoula, we are a housing counseling agency, and we provide renter education as well as home buyer and financial education and counseling. We have been doing this work in our housing counseling agency here in the Missoula area, but COVID necessitated that we take our education and our coaching and counseling online. And so we've expanded our financial skill building to statewide. And in fact, there are people from outside of the state that are now registered for our class. In fact, this month we have somebody from Minnesota registered for our financial skill building class. Matt just did an excellent job of covering the current state of the rental market. So really, I don't really need to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. The one thing I'll mention is, as you know, the housing choice voucher waiting list here in the Missoula area is currently overprescribed. It's always been overprescribed. There's always a greater demand than there are resources. But unfortunately, we continue to see it go up at a pretty sharp clip. The current wait list is about 1,900 folks, and it's up from 1,700 last year, which would, of course, make sense based on the market data that Matt just presented. This is a clip from our annual report. We utilize this as a way to show the number of folks that we've served in our regional homeownership center. And the thing that we like to be able to show here in real numbers for Missoula market is the numbers at the bottom of this figure, which are showing you really what it's like to be a home buyer in Missoula County and what it's like to be a renter in Missoula County. You know, the takeaway that I see from this is that there's a real disparity in wages for both renters and homeowners when it comes to having enough money to afford a home. And when we mean affordable housing, we say, well, 30% of one's income towards their rent and utilities or their mortgage and utilities is what's considered affordable in the United States. So, you know, you can see here with these figures, there's a dramatic difference between renter wages and homeowner wages. At Homeward, through the not only the homes that we build, but also through the classes and the counseling that we provide, we're really helping people chart a path to saving money, paying down debt, and being able to eventually have enough money for a down payment to purchase a home if that is their goal. So, you know, even such, when we look at the current statistics in Missoula County, where the median homeowner income is around $72,000, but the income to afford the current market or the current median home price of $438,000 is double what the current homeowner wages are. And just to put that into, I guess, ground that information, I think about, I've owned my home since 2005 here in Missoula. And I think about my mortgage, what I pay in my mortgage compared to what people are paying for a 1 and 2 bedroom rent. That's the dramatic difference we've seen in a 15-year period here in Missoula. And I think these numbers really demonstrate that. So the good news is our homebuyer education class still has a lot of interest. We have about 50 people per month that take our homebuyer education class. But in July, we had one of our volunteer presenters, realtor, present that there's about 9 homes available under $300,000 in the entire Missoula market. So you can imagine it's very challenging for graduates to find a home that they can purchase, particularly because they are competing with people that have maybe little or no need for financing. So we're seeing things like people surpass their right or need to have a home inspection. And then that can facilitate a faster closing, which puts a lot of people out of the running then to actually being able to purchase a home. So one of the things I found interesting to add to Matt's presentation is I'm on the steering committee for the comprehensive economic development strategy that is a process being undertaken by the Missoula Economic Partnership. And this conversation, if not one of the most significant, is probably the most important element that is being talked about as part of Missoula County and certainly the city of Missoula's need to address in terms of a comprehensive economic strategy moving forward. And I think Matt did a great job of articulating some of the challenges that we have in terms of economic growth and stability here as a result of this situation. So I wanted to just include a couple of anecdotal examples of rental challenges. And as City Council, you hear this, of course, quite a bit from your constituents. People are coming and expressing their challenges. A staff member of mine does participate is a member of the Rent Around Missoula Facebook group. And that's Carissa Trujillo, and she grabbed some examples for me just to be able to share with you. And I'm sorry, I know this is small print, but you can see that there are posts on this Facebook group. The first one says, does anyone have a lead on a 2-bedroom house or apartment for 2 folks, a cat and a dog? Budget of $1,600. One of our HOT team members, and as you know, HOT team are the housing outreach team members for the Poverello Center. They are desperate to find housing as her lease was not renewed. And I think that's a really good example of a local employer, their employee not being able to find a home. And as we all know, HOT team members are incredibly important for us to be able to continue addressing our challenges with homelessness. Another on here, my landlords are selling their home. I've been in it for 3 years. I can pay up to $2,500 a month for a 3-bedroom home, but they can't find it. This one at the bottom here was just something I learned the other day. It was from a friend of mine who is now a real estate agent, and they called to ask some information about pricing of single family homes as rentals. But her neighbor, who owns a local business, they live in the Lewis and Clark neighborhood, and their home just had a 20% increase in rent, and they already paid $2,000 a month. So now they pay almost $2,500 in rent. It's really just astronomical. The trend that we're seeing in our financial skill building program is that we're seeing more and more people come and take our class because they can't afford their rent. Recently, a staff member of mine shared an example of a personal friend. Her daughter is trying to secure a home. She works for the Marriott. She's in her early 20s. She gets paid $12.50 an hour, and she's doing her best to make ends meet with her boyfriend, and they can pay a rent of around $1,100. They're paying a rent for about $1,100 per month for a 1-bedroom, which is, you're doing that math, that doesn't leave a lot for other costs of living. So Homewards residents, a quick glimpse into our residents. By nature, what the work we do, we build homes that are affordable to Missoula's residents, and they are deed restricted affordable. So by nature, we're more stable because we're not at the whim of the market. About 92% of our residents are able to pay their rent. 8% are on payment plans. When the pandemic hit, and before a federal moratorium was put in place, Homeward and our management company, Tamarack Property Management, we put an eviction moratorium in place with our residents because we're in the business of keeping people in their homes, not evicting people. And obviously, we've been following all of the federal moratoriums since then. Tamarack really emphasized payment plans and communication between residents and the property management company. And they work to actively connect residents to the emergency rental assistance program that no doubt Cheryl will go into a lot more detail. One of the things that we also chose to do was we did no rent increases in 2020, not knowing what the stability of our residents would be. We didn't want to increase their rental costs. I'll talk about the challenge that poses for us as owners here in a second. I asked our property management company about trends and data they could share. And, I'll tell you that most of the information we have to share with you is mostly in an anecdotal form. And that's because both Homeward and our management company, we sort of lack financial resources to have some of the in-depth data analysis that we really desire. But this is how they summarized it for me, that, the residents in our properties, whether this be pre-COVID or post-COVID, living with low and moderate wages in this market can mean making affordable rents hard when you lose a job, your income changes or decreases, you have medical bills that surpass your ability to pay for those, and you have unexpected emergencies. I mean, just by nature of it, you live thinly on the margin. And then without rental assistance, in which case, most of Homeward's properties don't have rental assistance. They're affordable rents, but the resident needs to make that rent. There's not necessarily rental assistance that comes along with that. So if somebody loses their job, there's no ability to just get a rent reduction. Now, in some affordable properties out there with rental assistance, you can do that. You can apply for a rent reduction because you've lost your income. One of the trends is that there's a lot of people living in between, right? They make enough to qualify to live at one of Homeward's properties, but they make too much to qualify for other assistance to consistently make ends meet. So, for example, SNAP, or what we know as food stamps, or childcare vouchers, right? So they're living on the edge. One of the major challenges for our residents, as well as being an owner of properties, is the mental and behavioral health of some of our residents. Several live with these challenges but don't have access to assistance with medications or treatments. And as you can imagine, that can really create disruption, not only for them and the stability for that resident, but also their neighbors. Criminal activity. There's obviously we have a fair housing imperative to rent to folks with a multitude of backgrounds. And as you know, there's a greater effort around a need to make sure that we are renting to folks that live with barriers. We do and have seen a trend at certain properties where we have guests or friends of residents that are causing some criminal activity. And the issue for our residents is they often don't feel safe making a report. So I'll go into some of the resources that we're trying to bring to those properties, but it is an experience and it is a challenge that our residents face. And then, some of the other things that residents experience are property inspections. Because we are deed restricted, affordable housing with a capital A, we live in a very intense regulatory environment. And that means that there is a lot of compliance that we as owners and property managers, as well as our residents, need to adhere to. Some of the challenges out there in the market, and both with our residents, is just challenges accessing the emergency rental assistance program. And the state's done an excellent job of continuing to troubleshoot and listen to folks on the ground like ourselves around solving for some of those challenges. Ultimately, there continues to be challenges out there in the greater market in the United States around renters accessing the emergency rental assistance program. And I think you'll hear more and more of that as we talk about this eviction moratorium extending and then what to do after. Resources for residents of affordable housing: the Montana Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which Cheryl will go into. Anecdotally, we believe about 25% of our residents have accessed the Emergency Rental Assistance Program since the beginning of the pandemic. We continue to try to make that information available to residents. The management company refers our residents to local resources. 211 is a kind of a clearinghouse of information and a really easy to access website. You could just type in 211 Missoula and you can actually find a whole list of different kinds of resources available to help with, anything from medical to income to a number of different resources in Missoula. These are just some of the resources that Tamarack refers our residents to: 543 HOPE, Homeward's Financial Skill Building, the Human Resource Council's Emergency and Interim Assistance Program, as well as their Section 8 and Missoula Housing Authority Section 8 programs. Missoula Housing Authority also has public housing and supportive housing vouchers. So they've got a couple of different programs there. But as I mentioned earlier, they're all overprescribed. And then, of course, Montana Department of Commerce's Section 8 program, which also has a waiting list, but it is there and it's important to get people connected with those. We have been working with the Neighborhood Watch Program and the City of Missoula Police Department to do some neighborhood watch programs at some of our properties where there's been some criminal activity that's been challenging. One of the things that I felt was important to bring up today, so folks had a better understanding of some of the dynamics and challenges that we face as affordable housing providers. Speaking to the criminal element, we may get a complaint from a resident, and the property manager the burden is on them to pursue the reality, right? But unless there is a formal complaint, which often residents won't make out of concern for their own safety, and two, if there's not a police report made, by law, the property manager is not in a position to take action. If there is an opportunity to take action and pursue notification and trying to get this cleared up, it is not the property manager's ability to communicate the status of that to another resident. And so residents can feel out of the loop, and that can be a challenge for a management company that has an enormous amount of responsibility on their plate to not only do day-to-day property management, but when you property manage a deed restricted affordable housing property, the responsibilities are quite a bit higher than market rate because we're held to higher standards for a number of different reasons, and we have an incredible amount of compliance overhead and compliance in a regulatory environment. And so it poses a challenge for us as property owners and managers to have enough resources, I would say, for residents to feel supported, communicated with effectively. Some of the issues we've been working and dealing with since the pandemic is that we have a slightly higher vacancy rate in some of our properties due to the fact that we have some hard turnovers. We've had some challenging issues where we've had some really significant hard turns, we call them in the market, meaning that we've got to basically rehabilitate the apartment. Well, just like the construction industry, there's a shortage of labor, there's a shortage of materials, and there's a shortage of vendors. If that apartment is not rent ready, then obviously it sits vacant. So that's one of the challenges we've been facing. And then when it is rent ready, we need to go out, our property manager needs to do third-party verifications for all sorts of income. And those are taking longer in this environment of the pandemic. Employers are less responsive. And in fact, some of the regulatory agencies are as well. Things are getting better, but there has been a lag, and ultimately that's been a challenge for us. And I would just mention that as a developer of affordable homes, the projects under construction in 2020 and 2021 have been affected greatly by the pandemic in terms of price, cost overages. There have been delays, of course, due to labor shortages, material shortages. Then when it comes down to actually renting the apartment, the issues I mentioned earlier, and ultimately those are financial impacts to projects for the long term, right? We had to spend more money to get the project completed. What does that mean for Homeward? Well, over a 36-month period that it takes to build these properties, Homeward does earn a developer fee, but we basically had to put that back into the project in order for the project to be successful. That's challenging for us as an organization, but it also means the project needs to pay off more debt. So ultimately, it's a long-term challenge that we're solving for, but one that I think it's important to mention for you. So resources for landlords. Homeward has the Landlord Liaison program, and we're happy to announce that the County of Missoula has looking to extend funding for the upcoming year. Has not been a final decision yet, but it's looking good. Our Landlord Liaison basically supports landlords and property managers by connecting them to resident support resources in the community. He also teaches a rent-wise workshop for people to understand the best way to be their own advocate, to be able to compete in a really tight market, and to be able to improve their credit and clean up any issues that make them maybe not look so good on paper compared to somebody that has more resources. And the idea here is that we're really building relationships with area landlords to being willing to take a resident that might have a Section 8 voucher, for example. A lot of the mom and pop landlords that we were just talking about don't actually have experience with some of these complicated programs, and we want to help bridge that. Our major goal is to keep people in their home, to get into the home and stay in the home. But our secondary goal is to reduce evictions. And unfortunately, when sometimes that's a go-to mechanism. And what we want to do is being able to help people get out of a home if it's not working for the landlord. And second of all, to avoid an eviction on their record, because that ultimately makes it more difficult for them to be able to rent in the marketplace. It's also not good for a landlord. As one, I can tell you, evictions are very expensive. And this, of course, is in an environment when you might be evicting for things that are not a rent issue. Because as a reminder, the CDC eviction for eviction moratorium is only for the inability to not pay rent. It's not for other lease violation issues. Recently our landlord liaison actually worked with somebody who their rental agreement was not renewed. And this person didn't realize that they weren't being evicted. There's a difference there. Your rent, your home, your lease not being renewed doesn't mean you're necessarily being evicted. To the person, it feels that way, right? You're being evicted from your home. This person, unfortunately, was marking down on rental applications that they were being evicted. So fortunately, we were able to clarify for him that he's not being evicted. It's just that his lease was not being renewed, because ultimately he was putting out rental applications that were showing a record that would prevent him from finding a home. I mentioned, I'm sorry, I know I'm over my time, the Landlord Liaison program. We also have a risk mitigation fund, which is sort of like an insurance program to incentivize landlords to be our preferred partner. And it works as an enticement for folks to take on residents that might have higher barriers, like folks that are reintegrating from the corrections system, or folks that might have an eviction on their record, because we really want to try to help people get into a home and keep it. And so with that, I'll go ahead and end my slideshow and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for the presentation and all the information and for all the good work you do.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions for Andrea?
I have a question. This is Sarah with Sterling CRE, and I should probably know the answer to this. So hopefully you can help me out. Is it the case that there are only specific counties in Montana that are covered by the eviction moratorium? Is that correct?
No, I don't believe that to be the case. And Cheryl, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that the CDC eviction moratorium is applicable to every county in Montana.
So I'll just add briefly, if I can, the CDC eviction moratorium, the primary one that covered all counties ended on July 31st. And late yesterday, the Biden administration released an updated CDC eviction moratorium, which we're still assessing at the state level. It looks like that eviction moratorium is specific to counties that have a more significant or higher spread of COVID. But the initial reports indicate that that could cover like 90% of jurisdictions throughout the United States. So it still appears to be the case that a large portion of Montana could be covered, but it will be dependent on the local areas' transmission rates.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Do you know if that will change as transmission rates change?
I think we're still trying to get our arms around it since it just came out late yesterday. But it looks to me at first glance that as a county's transmission rate increases, they could become then eligible under the CDC moratorium as it's newly conceived. And then if their transmission rates go down, maybe they wouldn't be protected. So that's adding some complications.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. I have Heather next and then Julie.
Thanks. This question is to Andrea, Matt, and Montana. You've presented a lot of really great information today. And I guess my question is of all this data that was presented to us, what does it lead you to believe that our best options moving forward that address both supply as well as the stability factors? How do we move forward as a community so that we can have better outcomes, so that we can have more housing, both rental and home ownership units on the market? Because what we have today just isn't enough.
Thank you, Councilwoman Harp. And if I might, I know we have about 30 minutes left, and I would love, that feels sort of like a bigger question that maybe all of our presenters could help us answer. So I wonder if we could hold that for after Erin and Cheryl's presentations as well.
Bookmark it, Montana. Thank you.
I will.
Thanks, Julie.
Hi, thank you all for everything you've presented. Andrea alluded to this, but I guess my question is, do we have any numbers about the number of folks who have been able to access the Montana Emergency Rental Assistance? And maybe someone is going to address that in the next presentation. Okay, then I will also hold my question.
Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and carry on. Erin, I think you're up next.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for the invitation to speak today. I've been asked to come forward to this group and speak from the perspective of a market rate property manager and property owner. So for a brief background, I'm the owner operator of Summit Property Management. We manage residential and commercial properties in and around Missoula. I'm also presenting the experiences, observations, and perspective of several of my colleagues. I did take a poll of at least a half dozen other owners of property management companies in Missoula. And so the information I'm going to share and perspectives and anecdotes are sort of a collaboration of all these different entities. The first thing I wanted to just acknowledge, and I'm not going to go into a lot of statistics. We've heard a lot again and again about the extreme low vacancy margin. We've talked about that during this presentation, I think, mostly in terms of the last several years. And just anecdotally, I wanted to mention, from my experience of a little over 20 years of managing rental properties, I have never seen conditions anything like what we're experiencing right now with a sub 1% vacancy margin. I also spoke with a colleague of mine, another owner of a property management company who's been at it for 40 plus years, and he has never seen or heard of any conditions like this. Even in Missoula, where someone else pointed out that, historically, we generally have had low vacancy margins relative to the rest of the country, our market being what it is. But right now it's just a unique moment and a unique challenge, as we're all very well aware, but extending back quite a number of years. So specific to the subject that I was asked to talk about, which included my experience and observation, and again, others in the same field as myself, with respect to late payments by tenants, non-payment by tenants, and then extending into evictions. My experience and those of my colleagues as market rate property managers may be a little bit different than some of what we just heard. But I really, as we've scoured the records and data of how things have looked over the past 18 months or so during the pandemic, we really have not seen a substantial change in non-payments, late payments, and we've had no evictions. Of course, there's been a moratorium there, so we historically have a very low incidence of evictions anyway, certainly for my company and the others that I spoke with. But that has been essentially non-existent, and that's been rather surprising, I think, to all of us that I'm speaking for, that we have had such a sort of remarkably low incidence of non-payment. So I did want to mention also, as extends into the CARES Act and the assistance available to renters with issues paying rent due to COVID, I've also been very surprised to see a remarkably low utilization of that program. And to quantify that, speaking for my company, we manage around 1,000 residential rental units, and we have had less than 5 individuals or groups of tenants take advantage of the CARES Act. I spoke to several others who had similar. The most I heard was another company of about the same size that had 20. And keep in mind, that's across the span of 18 months or thereabout of, so that's a lot of opportunities for that to be taken advantage of. And we just are not seeing that, at least in what we're doing. I will also say that we have gone out of our way, of course, all along and continue to do all we can to educate tenants about the availability of that assistance, going as far as offering to help complete the applications, and we're just not really seeing it being taken advantage of. I guess to summarize, perhaps unlike some of what we heard among market rate property managers, we are not seeing a higher than normal level of non-payment, late payment, or evictions. The primary observation and challenge, and it is a challenge in every direction, whether it's for property owners, property managers, renters, is the extreme low vacancy margin. So that's really obviously the problem we're here to try to solve. So I'm happy also to take any questions now or in the collective question session.
Thanks, Aaron. Any quick questions for Aaron before we move on? Heather.
Thanks, Aaron. I guess the question I have is, if only 5 out of 1,000 of those tenants were even familiar or used the rental assistance, what could your firm as well as others do differently to inform tenants about the rental assistance fund and actually make a difference for those who actually may need it?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I do feel, at least speaking for my company, we did on a repeated basis across the spectrum of all of our tenants, make it known what the resources were, how to access them, offer to help. And then on a targeted basis, if we saw instances of people having problems at any point along the way, then we reached out directly to those individuals with someone on our staff offering to help with the paperwork. And we just did not see it taken advantage of very frequently. So from my perspective anyway, and I'm sure of course, there's always probably more that could be done, but I don't think from my perspective that it's for a lack of informing people or trying to help facilitate the utilization of those programs. It's most certainly in everyone's interest that they be taken advantage of where they're needed. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I'm seeing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Thanks, Stacy.
Thanks so much. Aaron, my question is for you, and I really want to say thank you for taking some time and coming and participating in this conversation, being willing to take questions. It's really interesting to hear from the private sector components of this. So thank you for that. And I guess my question for you is, we are hearing in the presentation that some folks are seeing increases in rents, and I would be curious from your company's perspective, how do you, what is the process that you go through to analyze when rate increases and take effect, and how you determine those numbers and whatnot, and just would be really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, Stacy, thank you. That's a great question. Well, under normal circumstances, primarily landlords, well, first of all, as property managers, we are performing the work as a service provider to the landlords who own the properties. So, of course, a big component of answering your question is that we're actually taking direction from those who are the actual decision makers, the property managers. So it's not so much at the whim of the property manager as it is at the directive of the property owner that increases in rent or other kinds of adjustments are put into effect. But typically under normal circumstances, we would be looking at a factor, not unlike a commercial lease of a small, modest percentage increase to keep up with the ever increasing property taxes, property insurance expense, maintenance expenses. Andrea spoke, I think that was terrific. The very important observations that she articulated about the challenges of finding vendors and finding people to do work between tenancies and the ever increasing costs to accomplish that work. All of those factors play into the necessity of a small percentage increase between tenancies or at lease renewals just to keep up with those increasing operating costs. At this time, given the market conditions where rents are increasing rapidly across the board, we try to take the best reasonable ethical position we can with our clients and counsel them not to put into effect dramatic increases, certainly on existing tenancies at renewals. And we've had, I think, good success kind of bringing folks back down to the ground with that when they are wanting to see a very large increase, which they may be able to get, but doesn't feel like the right thing for our community. Of course, that being said, there are exceptions and there are times where that's insisted upon. And again, the decision maker ultimately is the property owner. So I don't want to suggest that that never occurs, but it's the exception rather than the rule.
Thanks.
Thanks for that. I appreciate the distinction between managing versus owning a property and kind of where your decision-making space is.
Certainly.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time, so we can move on to the resources portion with Cheryl.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join your panel today. My name is Cheryl Cohen, and I'm the administrator of the Housing Division with the State of Montana Department of Commerce. The Housing Division includes the Montana Board of Housing, which is our statewide housing finance agency that's administratively attached to the Department of Commerce. The board allocates housing credits and issues tax-exempt bonds for affordable single-family homeownership programs. And the board includes 7 directors who are appointed by the governor and approved by the state Senate. Our division also includes a rental assistance bureau, which is the statewide public housing authority for Montana. And we administer a number of rental assistance programs like the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program. And following a recent reorganization at Commerce, we also now administer several HUD community planning and development programs for the production and preservation of affordable housing, like the Home Investment Partnerships Program and the Housing Trust Fund. So collectively, those different component units, we conduct our business and are known in the community as Montana Housing. And so I'll go ahead and pull up my slide deck, and Montana, let me know if I am not successful in sharing the right screen. Not successful?
It looks great.
Okay. So first, I just want to touch on what are our current kind of regular annual resources available for affordable rental development throughout the state. So first, we have the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. So that includes the competitive 9% credit and the 4% non-competitive credit. So the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program was created in 1986, and it was made permanent in 1993. It's an indirect federal subsidy that's used to finance the construction and rehabilitation of low-income affordable rental housing. So lawmakers created this as an incentive for private developers and investors to provide more low-income or affordable housing. And without this incentive, affordable rental housing projects generally do not have sufficient profit to warrant the investment. So the housing credit gives investors a dollar-for-dollar reduction in their federal tax liability in exchange for providing financing to develop affordable rental housing. The investor's equity contribution subsidizes the housing development, and therefore it allows the units to rent at below market rates. And in return, those investors receive credit that's paid in annual allotments, generally over a 10-year period. So with our competitive 9% program, we have $28.85 million available for this current year cycle. We just received our applications for this year's cycle that were invited for full application on Monday. And the Board of Housing Directors make the credit decisions on those allocations at our October meeting. The 9% credit can subsidize up to 70% of the low income costs of the project. So it's usually new construction or substantial rehabilitation. And there's a 15-year compliance period and a 31-year extended use period. So these properties are available as affordable housing with deed restrictions for 46 years. Again, it's a 10-year credit, and we've got 28.85 available. We're routinely oversubscribed by at least 3 to 1 for that competitive credit. The state also has the 4% credit, which is a non-competitive credit, and it can subsidize up to 30% of the low-income costs in a project. It's not a competitive project, and it falls under the state of Montana's volume bond cap. So I won't get too into the details here, but for 2021, the state of Montana had a volume bond cap of about $325 million. There's a split between the state, which is 70% of that, with other local issuers at 30%. And then there's a set aside amongst the state for housing specific use. And so the amount available for that housing is listed here at that 93 million. We also have some carry forward of the 4% bond cap that maybe wasn't tapped in previous years, and we have that available. So there was a recent fix in federal legislation at the end of last year that has really improved the equity of that credit. We're hearing by upwards of 30%. And the result is we're seeing a really significant uptick in that 4% pipeline. And so you can see from the chart here on the slide, for all of 2020, we allocated about $112 million for that 4% credit for construction of new affordable homes. And just this far for June of this year, we've allocated $121 million. So that includes both the current year available plus some carryover that we've had for from the prior year. And we have about maybe another half a dozen projects in the pipeline. So we're seeing a really high uptick in the use of that. And it's a goal at the state level to make sure that we maximize the use of this 4% credit. And it's a particularly effective tool for urban development. And I know developers like Homeward have been really kind of instrumental in being able to maximize the use of that fund. We also have the home program. So we have just over 3 million this year for that, and the housing trust fund also about 3 million. And for the community development block grant program, we have about 750,000 designated for housing use. Just to note that Missoula does receive direct allocations of home and CDBG allocations from HUD, and those are noted on the screen. So I just wanted to briefly outline the state investments of resources in the Missoula area. So we currently have 4 projects under construction totaling 438 units, and that's nearly $60 million in housing credit investments and over $4.6 million in the CPD funds, the home and the housing trust fund. Another 24 new construction projects are in operations. So that's over 650 units, and that was 61 million in allocation and awards. And the state also supported the acquisition of 6 projects for rehab with over $21 million in investments. So in total, the state allocated or awarded $146.9 million for affordable rental home development in Missoula, producing 1,451 affordable homes. And just to highlight, the use of CPD funds like home and HDF have been pretty significant in the Missoula area, with 17% of our 2016 to 2020 home allocations going to Missoula projects, and 26% of the housing trust fund allocations also supporting Missoula projects. And part of that is because Missoula developers like Homeward and others are presenting projects that effectively compete for those programs. So the housing trust fund, for example, targets households at extremely low income levels, so 30% of median income and below. And Missoula projects have come forth with properties proposing to meet those income targets. So I want to go through and summarize some of the new state resources that have been made available under the recent 2020 CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was signed in December of last year, also known as CARES 2, and the recent American Rescue Plan Act from March. So under the CARES Act, the 2020 CARES Act, the state received just over $10 million for community development block grant coronavirus relief funds. And these funds are can have counties, cities, and towns as eligible applicants. And at least 3.9 million of the state's allocation is required to serve communities that are outside of the 3 entitlement cities. So Missoula, Great Falls, and Missoula do receive direct allocation of the CDBG-CB funds. So we can use part of the state's funds to support Missoula projects, but we do have to make sure that it doesn't go over that federal limit of 3.9 million. So the funded activities need to demonstrate that they prevent, prepare, or respond to COVID-19, and they must benefit low and moderate income persons. So 80% of the funds we need to expend within 3 years of our signing the grant agreement with HUD, which we've just signed and will be submitting this week. And then the deadline for 100% expenditures will be in 6 years or in August of 2027. So we're going to be pushing out some communications probably the end of this week, early next week. We're going to be taking applications with an application deadline likely mid-September for this program. So I'll touch on emergency rental assistance in the next slide and just go quickly through a couple of these other new programs. The next one, emergency housing vouchers, were included in the ARPA bill. Our Rental Assistance Bureau received 109 emergency housing vouchers, and these are like the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 voucher, but they're targeted for homeless or at risk of homeless populations. And some of those 109 vouchers were initially allocated by HUD to the Great Falls Housing Authority, but Great Falls declined that allocation, and so the state will be administering those. Missoula Housing Authority is the only other local public housing authority in Montana that received, accepted, and will be administering their own emergency housing voucher program. So we've been working with the Department of Public Health and Human Services and the statewide continuum of care to develop this new program. And it requires a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Commerce and the state continuum of care for referrals of applicants from local coordinated entry systems. And so that MOU was executed at the end of last month. And we'll be working with the local coordinated entry systems, including Missoula, over the coming months to get that program up and running. The next one listed here is the Home ARP or the Home Supplemental. This was also included in the ARPA bill. It's a little over $11 million. We're still waiting for further policy guidance from HUD, which they've indicated won't be available till later in the fall. But many on my team are already joining HUD webinars on the Home ARP program. And they're really recommending, HUD is really recommending that administrators like the state coordinate with homeless providers, including continuums of care and other service providers to develop these programs. And the intent of the Home ARP is to serve homeless individuals or families, those at risk of homelessness and other vulnerable groups. The expenditure deadline for this program is September 2030. And also Missoula did receive a direct allocation. I believe it was around 1.3 million for this program. So to talk a little bit about the Montana Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and I'll give you some updated numbers because when I completed this slide deck, I had through July 25th. We received under the Consolidated Appropriations Act or the CARES 2 bill in December, $200 million for the state of Montana for emergency rental assistance. And then following that in the ARPA bill, we received an additional $152.4 million for emergency rental assistance for a combined total of $352.4 million. We launched our emergency rental assistance program on April 5th under using the $200 million for the CARES 2 bill. And under that program, we can use up to 10% or $20 million for a combination of housing stability services and administrative costs. So the Department of Commerce, we're working to keep our administrative costs to 3% or below, and we're working with the Department of Public Health and Human Services to shift up to the difference, around 14 or 15 million, to provide eligible housing stability services. We really want to maximize the use of these funds. So under the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we can support renters with incomes up to 80% of median income for rental arrears, utility arrears, and internet. We can go all the way back to April of 2020. We can provide 12 months of assistance, and if there's still a demonstrated need of housing instability, we can go an additional 3 months for a total of 15 months of assistance. For rent, we can pay up to $2,200 per month. There's no copay that the applicant needs to pay toward their rent. We can cover the full rent amount up to $2,200. And for utilities, we can cover up to $300 a month. The online application, we really strove to make it as simple as we could. It is primarily self-attestation that they've had a COVID-related financial hardship, and it can be directly or indirectly due to COVID. We don't ask for a significant amount of documentation. They really are just self-attesting to their financial hardship. We do ask for income documentation to verify that they meet the 80% of median income requirements, and our application reviewers assess that documentation. And then we also require evidence of their housing instability, which is a requirement from the feds and the Treasury guidance. And so that instability could be in the form of a late rent notice or a utility shutoff notice. Again, we try to be as broad as we can in our interpretation with what demonstrates housing instability. So you can see from this slide, under the CARES Act program that we administered in 2020, so this program here, that program lasted 34 weeks, about 8 months. We awarded about $8.4 million to just under 2,500 households for an average assistance of about $3,400 per household. With the changes that we made for administrating the program this year, through July 25th, so 16 weeks, we awarded over $13 million to over 2,300 households for an average assistance of about $5,600. And as of this morning, we're up to about $14.7 million with 2,649 households served. We're getting out around $1 million a week. So you can see also here, Missoula County, we provide a dashboard on our website. I think it was included on the agenda with a county by county breakdown of disbursement of funds. And as of this morning, Missoula County's residents in Missoula County have been supported with about $2.8 million in assistance. And so that's just behind Yellowstone County as far as the amount of funds that have been distributed. We have right now, and this is still fairly accurate, to date, we've gotten probably close to 4,500 applications. We have around 850 applications that are still under review. We haven't yet seen a huge uptick in applications following the 3-day suspension on the eviction moratorium and with the changes, but we're monitoring that, and we have staff ready to process applications. It takes about 20 days to process an application. We are required to make outreach attempts to landlords to ensure that we have the information we need to make payment on their renters' behalf. And the other thing that's not covered here is we've been partnering since I think October of last year with the Montana Legal Services Association on the Montana Eviction Intervention Project. And so we use some of the state's CARES Act coronavirus relief funds to support MLSA to hire attorneys that work pro bono across the state to serve households who are at risk of eviction and have a COVID-related impact. And I know the majority of the clients that they have been serving have been in the Yellowstone and Missoula County areas. And we're already in conversations with MLSA on extending that contract with the emergency rental assistance funds that we have available. So I'm really proud of the work that Montana has done and my team has done to administer the program. And here I'm just giving a little kind of state comparison based on our population with the amount of funds distributed and the total households served. We're really kind of holding our own in comparison with other states that may have quite a bit higher populations than our own as far as the amount of funds that we're getting out and the rate at which we're getting funds out. So we marketed with a firm to do social media, Facebook, radio, TV, newspaper, kind of all manner of marketing efforts. And we're also now working with the state budget office on a combined marketing effort that will occur for a variety of ARPA programs to do another renewed push. We have printed materials available that we've distributed through our technical assistance network. We contract with NeighborWorks Montana and about a dozen partner organizations throughout the state that can provide technical assistance to renters or landlords who maybe just need a little bit of help navigating that online application process. Applicants can call and we can schedule an appointment with them. We have an online scheduler tool, and then one of those partner organizations will call them at that appointment time to go over the application with them over the phone. And some of those partner organizations will even take drop-in appointments or provide a paper application that they'll take back at their office and then enter it into the online application for the state to process. So the Human Resource Council District 11 and the Missoula Food Bank and Community Center have been partners in that organization since the launch of the program back in April. And we are incredibly grateful for the work that they've done supporting Missoula residents. And I know I'm running long on time, so I promise it's the last slide. I just wanted to give a quick snapshot about the assistance that we've had throughout the state. And since 2015, Commerce has supported the development of over 3,300 units across the state, 866 of those being in Missoula. And not only does that support the renters and families who need affordable homes, but it also creates jobs and provides wages to local economies. And so investing in affordable housing is really, I think, as we're all in agreement, it's a great win for all of us and for our communities. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate all the information there. It is 2:00 and this is our scheduled end time. I'm going to keep the meeting going a little bit longer, but recognize that some of our meeting participants might need to go. Mayor Engen, do you have any closing remarks or anything? And just recognizing that you might have to go to another meeting.
I just wanted to thank everyone, all of the partners here who are working with the city of Missoula to make sure that our residents have safe, decent, and affordable housing. This is a tough problem, but I think it's pretty clear from what you have all heard today that no one here is resting until we make progress, and progress is being made. So I'm grateful to all of you, and thanks for your attention today.
Thank you, Mayor. Brian.
Thanks. I want to thank everyone that presented information. It was really helpful. Cheryl, really grateful for all of your data, and especially the information toward the end there around the emergency rental assistance. And to me, the thing that jumps off the page, so to speak, is the resources available there. And I tie that back to that number, Montana, that you mentioned at the beginning about the 9.1% with folks, essentially in arrears. And we have resources. There are resources in the state to help these people out who have that burden, that rental and utility obligations in arrears. So I think the most helpful thing also, it was great, Cheryl, to hear about the efforts, social media, radio, et cetera, around outreach. And I will simply conclude by saying, if there is anything that the city of Missoula can do to complement those efforts around outreach and navigation, please don't hesitate. I think those conversations and connections are already there, but I just want to emphasize that it seems to me we're in a situation where we have the resources. We need to connect those resources with the people in need.
Great points, Brian. Thanks. Heather and then Julie.
Thanks. And I want to express my gratitude for all of you presenting today, opening my mind up to some things that I was unaware of. And I'd like to circle back to the question I had asked earlier for you to contemplate. So with all this data that you have presented today, what would you express to be some really good steps forward and solutions to addressing our unaffordability crisis that we have?
I think if I could point back to that slide, the last slide that we showed, the supply delivery versus the growth of housing. I'm not suggesting that this is like perfect correlation is going to work every single time, but generally the supply and demand imbalance is what is driving up a lot of the rental rates and driving down vacancy, which means low vacancy means few options for tenants. That when we deliver enough units, that you can actually do something about it. And that happened in 2016, 2017, and then those effects kind of lingered into 2018, where there were actually some options at that time. At the end of 2018, there were landlords providing incentives to get tenants to move in because vacancy rates were going up. So it is possible to do something about it. We haven't matched that delivery of units since then. I think there's plenty of interest from investors, developers, builders to do that. But part of it is a matter of getting projects through the pipeline, both on, through regulation and zoning and all that sort of thing. So I'm optimistic about it. I think it is an achievable thing. Just it will take effort from private and public sector.
Thanks. Cheryl, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'd just like to echo what Matt expressed on the supply challenge. I think the state, we've been having a lot of conversations around, what would it take for private market developers to build more starter homes, smaller sized homes, higher density projects. What's the barrier for that? And is there considerations for zoning or permitting to enable more density? I know it's not necessarily a popular conversation to have higher density in some neighborhoods, but growth is coming. It's going to continue to come. And just on a personal note, I moved to Montana from Seattle a couple of years ago, so I'm part of the problem. But I feel like Missoula, everything I saw today is just mirroring the experience that we had in the city of Seattle with large companies moving in and their workforce coming in and the kind of challenges that it created. And so looking at the supply to get more units created as quickly as possible, I think is a good place to put effort.
Thanks. Julie. Oh, I'm sorry, Andrea. It looks like you want to weigh in too.
Well, thanks. I just thought I would quickly try to augment what was already said to answer Heather's question. It's a big, juicy, meaty question, and we could talk about this for a really long time. In addition to the supply and demand issue is really an understanding for what's happening in our society and economy in general. There's a lot to unpack here. I think we are doing a really great job as a community. In the 20 years I've been involved in this sector and in this industry, I've never seen the city of Missoula take such proactive steps in addressing this issue, and it should not let up on the gas pedal. Around the state, we're active with the Montana Housing Coalition, and we see a lot of interest around the state, but we see variable commitment to this issue. And I would urge you as leaders of this community to do what is necessary. And I don't necessarily know what that means, but further this conversation around legislative changes. And we all know that I know how limited you are. I participate actively at the legislature every year, and we had setbacks this year. And it's a big deal. I think we need to make sure that we continue to have options for the residents of the state. And the real estate market is the most politicized I've ever seen it. And it brings together almost every subsector issue that you can imagine: cutbacks in mental health, stagnant wage issues, all of these things that ultimately impact people's ability to find and afford and keep a home. So yes, we need to find options, and we need to find proactive ways in which we're going to have a different approach to delivery of homes on the ground. I completely agree. I think we need to look at the regulatory environment. I think we need to look at all the above. And yet it's cloaked in this much larger issue of the United States system and our federal finance system and the regulatory environment that we operate. So that's a big loaded question, Heather, because it's not an easy question to answer. But I guess what I want to say is, as a council, I feel like you've really stepped up and put policy in place, and don't let up on it. I sat on the steering committee for the city housing policy, and honestly, that data we used in 2019, it's old. And it's so challenging because as soon as you go through a public process and get all that information and put policies and strategy out there, the ground slipped out from underneath us. Nobody planned for a pandemic. I'm hearing a lot of anecdotal comments, but the frustrating thing for me is that this is a non-disclosure state. And honestly, when people say, who's buying the properties in Montana? We don't really know. And that comes back to a state legislative issue. And, we can continue to provide homes here, but we need to make sure we're doing something that the workers of this community of all incomes have the opportunity to purchase those, not just folks with resources that have the ability to come in and buy properties, because that's a real pressure, a market issue. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm happy to continue the conversation at another time. Thanks.
Thanks, Montana.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of our presenters. I just wanted to quickly mention, I know we're over time, but this morning, Erin and Kirsten and I presented on the CPDI budget for fiscal year 22. And I just want to mention that much of our requests that we made in the budget and much of the work and our projects that we're doing in the next fiscal year are targeted towards these very issues. A lot of our panelists mentioned that without kind of looking at regulatory code and taking on that code reform, we're not going to be able to make a lot of good progress on some of these issues. So as Andrea said, there's lots to talk about and we could talk about it for a long time, but I appreciate everyone's perspectives on that.
Thanks. And we'll have a final question go to Heidi.
Thanks. So I think my question's for Cheryl and centers around the new eviction moratorium. And I guess how, once you guys figure out what it means, I realize it's new, how that's communicated to the general public, and maybe if there's like a fact sheet of when it applies and when it doesn't, if maybe we can get looped in. So I know we get a lot of emails from people in the community that maybe have homes that are sold out from under them or are in precarious rental situations, and it would be really great to have a resource to email to them or connect them to so that they can, tap into the right, right bucket of where they can get help. So, yeah, I guess there's a question in there somewhere.
Absolutely. No, I think that's definitely on our radar and working with our legal counsel to digest the new moratorium guidance. And I think there's an opportunity for us to also work with the Montana Legal Services Association to help roll out messaging with the eviction intervention project that they're working on. We had just finished updating our website with the moratorium closing yesterday when the announcement came out. So we'll be working as promptly as we can to update, have new web content, and we'll shoot out a Gov delivery message to all of our listservs as well with the new guidance.
Thanks. Is there any public comment on the presentation? Okay, I don't see any public comment. I want to thank all of our presenters today for a very informative presentation and for all of your important work. And thank you, Montana, for coordinating this. Montana, do you have any closing remarks on your end?
No, thank you. Yeah, just as you said, thanks to all of our presenters and thank you to council for giving us a little extra time to dig into those questions.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great day. We'll be adjourned.